And we have breaking news right now that we want to turn to. Russian President Vladimir Putin has just spoken for the first time after that revolt from Wagner. ABC News chief foreign correspondent Ian Pannell joins me now on the phone. We also have ABC's Patrick Revolt in Kharkiv, Ukraine, and ABC News contributor and national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy. Ian, I want to start with you. What did Putin say, and what's the significance of it?
Yeah, Stephanie, this is the first time that Putin has spoken out, apart from his address to the nation, which was in the midst of the crisis. He seemed to be trying to put a cap on the crisis. I think one of the key takeaways from this, despite the fact that we were all reporting, and apparently it was announced, that everyone would be given an amnesty, he said that the organizers of the rebellion will be brought to justice. Criminal activity aimed at weakening the country will be dealt with, and he referred to the whole episode as a colossal threat. I mean, he thanked the security services and others. He accused Kyiv, Ukraine, and the West of trying to undermine Russia, that they wanted to see Russians firing on each other and wanted to sow chaos inside the country. So I think this is Vladimir Putin trying to show that, look, he is in charge and that everything is okay, there's nothing to see here. But of course, the reality is nobody's going to forget. I think one of the striking things about it, he said that all the country rallied around him, around the Russian government. And I don't know that that was the case. If you saw some of those astonishing scenes in Rostov-on-Don, where the locals came out to take selfies with the Wagner troops, to bring them food and water. They cheered and waved them goodbye like they were conquering heroes. But of course, for many Russian people, they've been fed this diet of lies for so long. To understand quite what was going on the ground, I think would have been difficult in the heat of the moment, especially as not everything was being reported. But this is an important moment. President Lukashenko was thanked by President Putin for playing a role in trying to bring an end to this march on Moscow. And Lukashenko himself is also addressing the nation. But there was certainly no backing down. There were no concessions. We had suspected that maybe he was going to announce that the defense minister Shoigu, perhaps the head of the armed forces, Gerasimov, perhaps though there would be some change of personnel, which we know is something that Prigozhin had set out to achieve. So in some senses, the ball will be back in Prigozhin's court, but Putin seems to have essentially said they're trying to go after him.
And Ian, we heard from the National Security Coordinator, John Kirby, earlier, just a few moments ago, actually. And it was interesting because he said that it was publicly known that Prigozhin was going to take this route, that he was going to move forward with this movement. What does that tell you about the system right now in Russia, being that John Kirby is saying that the U.S. was fully aware that this was going to happen over the weekend, but they're basically staying out of it and continuing to support Ukraine? But what does that tell you about what's going on in Russia?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I think, firstly, it's astonishing the idea that the United States knew that this was about to happen and the Russian government didn't. The Russian government certainly didn't look prepared in any way. Prigozhin and his fighters, and he said with their 25,000 of us, there was nothing like that number, marched into Rostov-on-Don, a key military hub for the Southern Military Command, took over military headquarters, a military airfield, with consummate ease. There was relatively little response, relatively little resistance. So it's kind of hard to imagine that the Russian authorities knew this. However, this didn't just come out of the blue. It came against a backdrop of increasingly outspoken and angry statements from Prigozhin, directed against the Russian military leadership. In fact, even earlier on that day, he basically accused the Russian military leadership of basing the war on a lie. I mean, he accused them of the very things that actually Vladimir Putin has been charged with. He said that the way that they've run the war is bad, it's been ineffective, that it's only his fighters who have been effective on the ground, and that there's some truth in that. He's accused them of starving Wagner troops of food, of ammunition, of vital kind of artillery shells and kit. So there has been a backdrop of this increasing anger against them. And then, of course, there was this incident, if it was real or not, we don't really know, where he says that they were actually shelled. But I think the other key thing for Prigozhin was that there was an active attempt to effectively try and subsume Wagner into the Russian Ministry of Defense. There was an order out that basically everyone should sign on with the regular military, and that was something that Prigozhin was resistant to. Whether it was because he would financially lose out or not, it's not clear, but also because he wields a huge amount of power. And of course, at some point, that's got to be a threat for someone like Putin who wants to control all the levers of power.
Absolutely, and we also heard from Prigozhin as well, saying that he had no desire to overthrow the government, and that the march was meant to stop Russian forces from absorbing Wagner. So what do you make of all of that message from Prigozhin?
Yes, I mean, look, there was some question when this all ended, you know, that Putin emerges humiliated and weakened. I think that's certainly true. But also many people have felt that Prigozhin had somehow played a great hand, that you know, he's going to get what he wants. And I'm just not sure that's what we're seeing right now. I mean, if Prigozhin says that this was all about trying to protect the Wagner fighters and the Wagner group from being subsumed into the Russian Ministry of Defense, well, you could just throw that in the trash can, because President Putin made it clear that those fighters will now either have to join the regular military, sign on with the Ministry of Defense, or go home. So it seems to me, if I understand exactly what happened, of course, we're all listening through a translator and we're all trying to make sense of that Wagner will cease to exist in its current form, at least on the front lines. There'd been a suggestion from Foreign Minister Lavrov earlier that perhaps they would only be active in Africa, in Mali and in the Central African Republic. But I don't quite see what Prigozhin has got out of this, other than demonstrating quite clearly to many people that Putin is no longer the powerhouse that we all thought he was.
And we've heard from White House officials, we've heard from President Biden saying that the support for Ukraine will stay. It is unwavering, they've said. How does this movement from over the weekend change the fight in Ukraine, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's one that frankly, every Ukrainian is asking. I mean, they were all quietly cheering from the sidelines, again, you know, watching Russians fight Russians when they've been attacked. Their cities have been devastated, their children have been kidnapped, their civilians have been killed by Russia. Then, of course, they thought that this would benefit them. And had it gone on longer, then Putin would have faced a choice. The only way to properly defend Moscow could potentially have been to withdraw some troops, some of the more capable troops, from Ukraine to defend Russia and to defeat Wagner. No, it didn't get to that stage because it was over with almost 24 hours after it started. So it's not clear how much this is going to benefit. I mean, the Ukrainians had said, and we spoke to one of the advisors around President Zelensky, who said, look, yeah, of course, we're going to try and take advantage of this. We're going to use it to try and press a counteroffensive. But he also said, the truth is that the Russians are dug in so well in multiple lines of defense that there isn't going to be a quick surge. It's not going to be what we saw last year around Kharkiv, where they were just taking enormous square miles every single day. No one's expecting that. The area is heavily mined. There are huge Russian defenses. But having said that, they do seem to have at least pressed their foot on the accelerator a little bit. You know, we are starting to see some more areas starting to be taken around the fringes. But I think it looked like it was going to be a golden opportunity for Ukraine, discord and disarray amongst their enemies. Now, it remains to be seen if the Russians can consolidate and dig in and everyone feels, OK, we've got over that crisis, then perhaps it will continue to be as difficult as it has been for the Ukrainians to retake their land. However, it's hard to imagine that things can quite go back to as they were before. And of course, they're now going to be missing those key Wagner fighters who've been so instrumental in some of the fighting in the east around Donbass.
We'll see how that fight changes. We also understand that President Biden is set to speak with President Zelensky at some point. We heard that from the National Security Council Coordinator John Kirby. So we'll see if we can get a readout of that conversation. Thank you so much, Ian. We want to turn now to Patrick Revel in Kharkiv. Patrick, you've learned that the Belarusian president has canceled a planned address. What more can you tell us?
Yes, definitely, that's right. The Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, was supposed to give a simultaneous speech at the same time as Vladimir Putin. They were both announced only about an hour ago, and we've just learned that that speech has now been cancelled. He is supposed to take questions tomorrow, apparently. I mean, Alexander Lukashenko was a wild card in this crisis. He played suddenly a seemingly pretty crucial role in negotiating an end to the crisis. He was the one who called Yevgeny Prigozhin and seemingly was able to convey this deal from the Kremlin that convinced him to turn back and to stop his mutiny. We know now, supposedly, that Yevgeny Prigozhin has been invited to go to Belarus, along with any Wagner fighters who don't wish to either join the Russian Ministry of Defense or to go back to their families, as Putin said. I think, listening to Putin, when we heard of, about even half an hour ago that he was going to give this address to the nation, his spokesman said that this speech would, without any exaggeration, determine the fate of Russia. Which are pretty big words, and they said that he would make major statements, important statements. I think when we actually listened to it, there was a lot of anger in what Putin said. There was quite a performance, but actually there was very, very little concrete in what he said. He said that Wagner fighters now can either join the Ministry of Defense or they can go to Belarus, and he implied that he did say that justice would come for those who organized the coup, but he didn't say how. And certainly he said that they could leave because that was his word. And I think what we're seeing here was an attempt just to spin this crisis. This was Vladimir Putin attempting to try and control the narrative and say to Russians, look, I managed to stop the crisis without any bloodshed. Look how magnanimous I am. And ultimately, didn't we all do this together? But obviously, anyone watching it yesterday knows that very much wasn't actually the case. No one really understood what was going on for much of the day. And obviously, it ended with Yevgeny Prigozhin leaving. And ultimately, without a question, this did look extremely chaotic and extremely weak to people around the world. But obviously, this is Putin trying to control the narrative around this crisis.
And Patrick, as you just said, that Putin said organizers of the rebellion will be brought to justice. Now, if the Wagner chief does go to Belarus, what would life be like for him there? Could he be safe there?
I mean, so Belarus is very much a vassal state of Russia, particularly since the revolution that broke out there, the mass protests that broke out there in 2020, and which were put down with Russian help. Alexander Lukashenko basically is a client of Vladimir Putin, but he does have this very complicated relationship where he's able to kind of balance it. And again, here, he's sort of acting as though he has this distance. Somehow it's okay for Yevgeny Prigozhin to be in Belarus, but not in Russia. We've heard rumors from Wagner fighters that they are going to go, some of them are going to go to Belarus, and there will be camps, that there are camps even right now being built for them to go and live there. I mean, I think there's also this idea that perhaps in the long run, Yevgeny Prigozhin can go back to his interests in Africa. And perhaps that will happen, but we simply don't know. Right now, it's also possible that Vladimir Putin, for all of his stern words now, ultimately won't be able to touch Yevgeny Prigozhin. He certainly, so far, hasn't been able to. We heard Yevgeny Prigozhin give this audio message earlier, where he sounded in good spirits and again claimed that he hadn't intended to overthrow the government. But I mean, really, obviously, an extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary crisis that we've seen in Russia, where we've seen someone like Prigozhin challenge the state. And the one thing that Vladimir Putin did make very clear here was that this was a real attempt to challenge the state. This was a real armed rebellion, and that they had to put down and put the very nature of the Russian state at risk. And that's an extraordinary thing to have happened.
It certainly is a very messy and dynamic situation there in Russia. Thank you, Patrick. Mick, what's your take on Putin's remarks? The first time we've really heard from him since the end of this mutiny. What did you think?
So, Stephanie, two things really stood out. One, that he acknowledged that this was a, quote, colossal threat. That's not something totalitarian leaders usually like to acknowledge. It shows that he had a serious concern about his own ability to stay in power. The second, which Patrick alluded to, and Ian did as well, is that he didn't concede to anything that we think Prigozhin would have asked for, such as removing the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, or the Chief of Staff, Gerasimov. Those are two individuals that Prigozhin had serious problems with, and quite frankly have failed at almost every level when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I think that really does show that, and the fact that he's going to force Wagner fighters into the MOD shows that Prigozhin did not get what we think he requested. Perhaps it was only a payoff that got him to go to Belarus and stop his advance toward Moscow.
And Ian, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Earlier, we heard from National Security Council Coordinator John Kirby, who said that there's still a largely capable militia in Ukraine, that the fight continues. It does not change that. You've spent a lot of time with Ukrainian troops. How do you think this revolt from over the weekend will impact their morale?
I mean, their morale is astonishingly high, given that the casualty rate is also astonishingly high, and we've witnessed that themselves. But for them, this is an existential struggle, and that doesn't really change. I think, if anything, perhaps it shows the fallibility of Russian forces, although I think that's been demonstrated quite clearly on the battlefield in multiple locations. On a practical level, unless the chaos that we saw seeps into the defences on the ground, and there's no evidence yet of that, I don't think it really changes the calculations. There's still a long, hard, bloody, violent slog ahead of them to try and retake their territory. But yes, of course they're energised. And certainly talking to senior Ukrainian officials, and Zelensky's made this point that Putin is not the strong man that many people thought. And I think that has to have an impact psychologically, to know that actually your enemy militarily isn't as strong or to be feared as you thought, but also that the leadership in Moscow kind of looks fallible as well. I mean, Ukrainians have been saying for some time that they predicted that the war in Ukraine would spill across into Russia, and we have to see whether Putin can consolidate. I think Steve Gagnon put this perfectly well earlier in the day. There are now cracks in the building, and cracks can lead to total dissolution. And chaos, and we'll have to wait and see if that's the case. But also structures can continue for some time. I think a lot depends really on how things go here on the battlefield as to how it's going to affect Putin's future and the future of Russia.
And you yourself said that you spoke with an aide to Zelensky, telling you that he believes the current chaos will further hinder Russia's war effort in Ukraine. Hopefully, him saying that hopefully it's the beginning of the end. Of course, we will watch it from here. Mick, I want to ask you the same question. How do you think this changes morale for the forces there in Ukraine, if at all?
So, Stephanie, I would have said that I couldn't see how the morale of the Russian shoulder could sink any deeper in Ukraine, but I think this actually would do it. Wagner is a group of essentially war criminals, but they are fighting, or they were fighting in Ukraine, and they were one of the few forces that would really, truly go on the offensive. They're no longer there. And now the Russian soldiers that are can see that the very government that sent them there is under threat from that group in their own country. So the destabilization of their country, the knowing that very few people have confidence in their leadership, whether it's Gerasimov or Shoigu, all the way up to President Putin, I think that only serves to make their morale worse. And of course, that is an advantage to the Ukrainian forces as they incrementally go through this counteroffensive.
All right. Thank you very much, Mick. Patrick, I also want to get to the latest on the fighting. Ukraine has landed troops on the Russian-held eastern bank of the river in Kherson. What's the latest on the ground?
Yes, Stephanie, I mean, as we've been talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, there was a notable development in the south, across from the liberated city of Kherson, on the eastern side of the river there. We know, mainly from Russian sources, that there has been a landing by a small number of Ukrainian troops, but they have supposedly been there now for about 3 days and have managed to dig in. The Russians are really struggling to dislodge them. The Russians supposedly have been striking them with aviation and with artillery. I mean, the numbers we're talking about, the Russians are saying only around 50 men. We simply don't know. What we're seeing is these very small boats bringing people over. But I think mainly one of the significant things that it does show, and from the videos that the Russians themselves are releasing, is how few positions the Russians seem to have on that bank right up against the river. And they say that's because of the flooding that was caused by the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam earlier this month, which caused that devastating flooding, but also did flood out many of the Russian positions on that area. And so one of the main reasons this matters is simply because there is, as we have been seeing, quite a lot of pressure on the Russians on the Zaporizhia front line to the east. That's where they've managed to make, the Ukrainians have managed to make at least some small dents in the Russian line, and right now are trying to wear them down. And by doing this, this simply, again, starts to stretch the Russians and starts to make them concerned what is going to happen. I mean, there is a theory that even the reason why this dam was blown up was perhaps because Russia was trying to block any kind of Ukrainian attack from the Kherson direction. And so to see that they have, again, the Ukrainians are again pushing here on that and making these very bold, very audacious landings, I think shows that we are very much still not yet into the main phase even of the counteroffensive.
All right, Patrick, thank you so much. I know it's late there in Ukraine. Our thanks to Patrick, Ian, and Mick. Really appreciate your time.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.